The African Union delegation has concluded its peace mission to Russia and Ukraine, and part of the Presidential Protection Unit and several members of the South African media were not able to be part of those engagements as initially planned. The contingent was stuck at an airport in Warsaw, Poland, before being moved to a hotel. We take a look now at how this has impacted reporting of the peace mission for audiences here at home. For that discussion, we're joined by the University of Johannesburg's head of internalization and professor at the School of Communication and Journalism, Professor Rodny-Gumede. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. I do beg your pardon if you could please just help with the pronunciation of your name.
It's all good. That's perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Your interpretation of events as they unfolded, I think it was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie who spoke about the danger of telling one side of the story.
No, absolutely. That's always a danger. And of course, as journalists, we need to find that balance and make sure that we cover both sides. And if we are cut off from a news story, we cannot do so. I think, though, that if we stay with the so-called African peace mission to the Ukraine, I think that that's slightly different in the sense that here we have then journalists traveling with the presidential detail and the presidential security detail as well, which sort of brings an element of embeddedness into the story already. And of course, here there are practical reasons maybe for why you're traveling this way, because it's difficult to have access to a war zone, hey? But since this is a peace mission, I think we're dealing with something else here. And I think that these are considerations that I need to think through as well. So what is the reason for traveling with the presidential detail? What are the premises for covering this story from the onstart? We've had actually quite little information as journalists about this so-called peace mission. You know, it sort of was set up by the African heads of states themselves as a diplomatic mission going both to Ukraine and to Russia. And we know that then the politics of South Africa here has been quite cautious in dealing with the two parties. And I think as journalists, we need to dissect that story first and understand what it is that we're dealing with as the core of the story.
Is that then what you mean by an element of embeddedness?
Yes, I think one needs to, understand the practicalities here. You're traveling into a war zone and so on, so traveling with the presidential detail and the security detail in this context might be warranted. But I also think that there are many ways that this story could be covered. And I think we also need to appreciate that these journalists, if journalists are ever detained, that of course goes against every grain of freedom of expression and the rights of journalists to cover stories without any fear of intimidation, or in this case then what could be perceived as a detention of journalists, curbing them from or preventing them from doing the job that they're there to do. But I also do think that when you then put yourself into the situation of traveling with the president, there are different reasons why you're doing that and how you want to get to the story.
You speak of different ways that the story can be covered. Rightfully, we should be asking questions about how everything came to be, that the peace mission then went on over to Russia and Ukraine. Equally important, though, Prof, is it not, to interrogate why journalists who pose no threat, who have no guns, the only shot they can shoot is a click of a camera, in terms of capturing small detail, which has now become big detail, because you've got reports by international media where they speak of the shelling, and you've also got the Ukrainians speaking of the shelling. Then you have the presidential spokesperson who says, well, everything was fine while we were here. We did not even hear that. And so we're not even able to get an idea or an understanding of exactly what happened because people were prevented from doing their work.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there are two things here that I think are important. So if you look at the coverage of the war in Ukraine, from the context of Europe and even North American media, where there is almost like a 24/7, relay of events and summaries of the week, what's happened, etc., which we don't have to the same. We are further removed from the conflict, if you wish. So I think that the story here is a different one. We have looked at diplomatic relations between the two nations, between our own nation and Ukraine, and particularly Russia maybe, where also South Africa is heavily criticized for not coming out harder against Russia, for example. So I think that that's one side of this story. And then, of course, there are many other in terms of then how do we deal with the fact that there are repercussions from this war that also hits us directly in terms of a world economic situation. So our story is slightly different. We are removed from the direct fighting of this war in that sense. So we have little, I think we as South Africans and even as South African journalists, we have little understanding of what happens on that daily basis. I think that downplaying the story about the shelling and what happened in Ukraine is one that comes from a place of, firstly, of course, where South African government needs to be absolutely sure that we, as a South African audience, understand that our president was never at risk, despite what happened and despite, some of the security detail being detained, etc. Now, we can come back to that as well. I don't want to go into too much of the diplomacy of issues. That's not my field, but still. But then the other issue here is, of course, that we might not always understand what the risks are and what that shelling means in a context of a war that has now gone on for over a year.
Prof, you mentioned that we are removed from the direct fighting. However, we are not removed from the direct consequence. As a result, there's been pressure on these African heads of state to then even put together this peace mission. As you mentioned, we'll get into that once we get more information and we get debriefed by some of the head of states. But I think we understand the nuances of an angle, the nuances of telling a story, knowing how you want to frame it. And so every time we get reports, it's third-hand reports. And here we had an opportunity first-hand to get a report, do a different angle in terms of how it impacts the continent and not being told why and how it impacts the continent. And so was that not important? And in shaping discourse, in shaping reaction, in shaping perception, the work that we do is critical. It is crucial in giving people information so they can make up their own minds. And here we have been starved of that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very, very important. And I mean, the reason why journalists are traveling with the president here is to get that kind of information and direct insight. And I think that, of course, it's always a big story. A president traveling, our own president or any president traveling abroad is a big story for a local audience. Even bigger in the context of an outgrown war, but even more so in terms of the issues of sort of diplomatic relations and our own involvement with the parties and so on that have been raised. So this is a super important issue for us. And of course, it's absolutely crucial that we have people who can cover this story for us. And I think that, having our own journalists there, giving the perspective of a South Africa for the, local audiences is really, really important. That said, there are many stories where we do rely on foreign correspondents and where we rely on foreign correspondents doing as a good job as our own journalists in covering stories in the field. So there is a balance here and one needs to understand what's happened. I think that in this instance, what we need to ask questions about is, of course, what is the violation of the rights to freedom of expression when you detain journalists in the way that they were done. But of course, we also don't know what other considerations there were in terms of traveling with the security detail and the diplomatic issues that happened on the ground when people were then refused entry or transfer in Poland due to some diplomatic issues.
Professor at the School of Communication and Journalism, Professor Rodny-Gumede, thank you very much, ma'am, for your time this morning.